said Eric, the fullest person in Fullsville. Everyone around had to admit he certainly looked very, very full indeed. His tummy bulged over his trousers. The buttons on his shirt were almost popping open. His cheeks were formed into little bulges like a hamster would have. "Very full indeed," he added in a worried kind of way. His wife put down her knife and fork and looked at her husband's plate. It still had food on it. "Oh dear," she said in a concerned kind of way. "And you haven't finished your dinner yet." "I know," he said in an even more concerned manner. "And I have to clean my plate before I can leave the table." "You do, dear," his wife agreed. It was the same for everyone in Fullsville. From the day they sat in their first high chair at their first proper meal, they were taught the golden rule of Fullsville. You can't leave the table until you've cleared your plate. So that's what everybody did. No scraps, no leftover icky bits of food, no scrapings for the poor dogs of Fullsville, just clean plates. But that didn't help the fullest person in Fullsville in his current predicament. Meanwhile, in a town not a million miles away, Herman waited patiently at the bus stop, as he did every day around this time. He didn't know where the bus would take him, but he knew he'd have an interesting time when he got there. Before long, a big red double-decker bus appeared over the brow of the hill. Written on the old-fashioned revolving destination board on the front was one word: Fullsville. "A return to Fullsville, please," said Herman to the driver. Groaned the driver. He continued. "I suppose so." "What's the matter?" asked Herman. It's just that I'm so full. I think I'll explode," said the driver. "Oh dear," said Herman. "Why are you so full?" I stopped at the usual transport cafe in Fullsville on my last trip there earlier today and had a bite to eat. It was just a steak and kidney pie, but it certainly filled me up. It was delicious, mind you," he added, and groaned one more time. He handed Herman his ticket and the bus set off. Meanwhile, back at the house of the fullest person in Fullsville, Eric was still struggling to finish his food. "It's these pies," he said. "They're so big." He stared down at the half-eaten remains of a thick, crusty pie on his plate. It was, without doubt, the most delicious pie you could buy in Fullsville. Thick and crusty and full of potatoes and vegetables and runny gravy that oozed everywhere when you cut into it. Eric had been eating these pies since he was a small boy. Now he wasn't small at all, thanks, in part, to the amount of pies he'd eaten. "I could eat these pies till they come out of my ears," he once said. But on this particular day, he didn't, because he thought they might. "I'm fuller than the fullest person in Fullsville." With that, he staggered up from the table, wobbled into the lounge, slumped into his favourite armchair, and immediately fell asleep. "Oh dear," said his wife. "He does seem unusually full." She decided to phone her friend. "Betty," she said when Betty answered the phone, "it's Mavis here. I'm a bit worried about Eric." "That's funny," said Betty. "I was just going to call you about Norman." Why? What's wrong with Norman? Well, Betty explained, I gave him one of his favourite pies, as usual, for lunch today. And he almost couldn't finish it, Mavis interrupted. How did you know that? Asked Betty in a surprised kind of way. Because that's what happened to Eric. And now, Betty continued, he's asleep in the lounge, they both said at the same time. I wonder, said Mavis. I'll call you back in 5 minutes. She picked up the phone and dialed her friend, Pearl. Funny, I was just going to call you, said Pearl. Not John too, said Betty. Not John too what? Said Pearl. Asleep, fuller than a very full person after eating one of his favourite pies, yes, interrupted Pearl. How on earth did you know? Mavis explained about Eric and Norman and her conversation with Betty. I think we'd better meet. Come round to my house in 10 minutes, she said. Meanwhile, Herman's bus had arrived in Fullsville town centre and Herman had begun to explore. He loved his daily adventures to new places and always looked forward to finding out what they had to offer. Every place that he visited was different and they all had good things about them. But there was always some kind of a problem which Herman managed to help out with. He didn't know quite how or why he was able to help, but he was always very happy that he could. Maybe it was because he was a visitor and could see things in a slightly different way to the people who live there all the time. Maybe it was because he listened to people's problems and really wanted to do what he could to help. Whatever the reason, he felt very lucky to have the chance to make a difference, and the thought made him whistle a happy tune out loud. He decided he was, however, happy but hungry. He set off down Fullsville High Street with a mission, to find somewhere he could get a snack. A few shops down the road, he reached the perfect place. Gribshaw's Pie Emporium, it said in big letters above the window, and written underneath was the slogan, famous for our pies. A pie, exclaimed Herman. Just what I feel like. And he walked towards the shop. Meanwhile, in another part of Fullsville, Betty, Mavis and Pearl had all gathered at Mavis's house and were sitting in the kitchen drinking a cup of tea and tucking into a plate of jammy dodgers. Why do you suppose they're all so full? Mavis asked Pearl. Pearl didn't have an answer. Maybe it's something they've all been doing before lunch, suggested Betty. Eric mowed the lawn, said Mavis. What did Norman do? Oh, the vacuum cleaning, said Betty. That's not it then, they both agreed. Maybe it was something they all ate for breakfast, said Pearl. John had kippers. What did Norman have? Toast and Marmite, said Betty. So it's not that either. Hang on a minute. I've just had a thought, said Mavis. There's one thing they've all got in common. Betty and Pearl looked at her eagerly. They're all asleep now? Asked Pearl. No, something they all did before they got so full. Watched TV? Suggested Betty. No, not that. Something they all ate. The pies! Shouted Betty and Pearl in unison. Exactly, said Mavis. But they've been eating the same pies for years, said Pearl, and they've always managed to finish them before. It's all very odd, they agreed. I did notice one thing, said Pearl a little later, as they were sitting round the kitchen table with a freshly brewed cup of tea. What's that? Said Mavis as she nibbled on a biscuit. The pie I cooked today did seem a lot bigger than usual, continued Pearl, but I just thought I was having a bit of a silly turn. Funny that, said Betty, but I thought the same thing. Me too, said Mavis. They each had a sip of tea, and then Pearl said, maybe we should pay a visit to the pie shop. My thoughts exactly, said Betty. But let's have another biscuit first, said Mavis. Eric was still snoring quietly in his chair as Betty, Mavis and Pearl put on their hats and coats and hurried towards Fullsville village centre. As they slammed the front door behind them, a button popped off Eric's shirt and landed in the goldfish bowl. Herman, meanwhile, was standing at the counter of quite possibly the best pie shop he'd ever been in his life. Glass-fronted display cabinets housed pies of all shapes and sizes. Written underneath them were names that alone made Herman want one. Broccoli, Stilton and apple. Free-range chicken and mushroom. Ham, sweet corn and cheddar cheese. Sun-dried tomato, roasted pepper, aubergine and butternut squash. And the pies were big. Really big. Herman couldn't remember ever seeing such big pies, yet they looked delicious and he knew he had to have one. Herman was just about to order when Mavis, Pearl and Betty came through the shop door. "We've come about your pies," said Mavis as they walked into Gribshaw's Pie Emporium. "Oh, not you too," said a small, worried-looking man from behind the counter. "You're the umpteenth people I've had in the shop this afternoon," he continued in a distressed sort of way. "And I've never had a complaint about my pies in all the years of owning and running Gribshaw's Pie Emporium." Pearl handed Mr. Gribshaw a tissue and he blew his nose very loudly. "What seems to be the problem?" asked Herman. "There's a problem with Gribshaw's pies," explained Mavis. "They look pretty good to me," said Herman, and even Mr. Gribshaw managed a smile between sniffles. "It's just they're so big," said Betty. "Our partners can't eat them," said Mavis, "and it makes them very full," added Pearl. "I shouldn't have stopped making the pies myself," said Mr. Gribshaw, "but I was getting so busy and Boris seemed so keen." "Who's Boris?" asked Herman. "Boris is my new assistant," explained Mr. Gribshaw, "and he's just started making all my pies for me." "Boris is a strange name for somebody from Fullsville," said Pearl. "He's not from Fullsville," explained Mr. Gribshaw. "He's from Russia, but he's following the same recipe that's been in my family for generations, I can assure you," said Mr. Gribshaw in an assuring kind of way. "Aha!" Herman suddenly said, causing everyone to jump. "Aha!" he said again, causing everyone to jump a second time. "What's the matter?" said Pearl. "I've just had a brainwave," said Herman. "Where's Boris now?" "In the kitchen downstairs," said Mr. Gribshaw, "baking pies for tomorrow." "Can we go and see him?" asked Herman. "Of course," agreed Mr. Gribshaw, and they followed him down the stairs and into a tiny room filled with baking equipment. In the middle of it all, surrounded by pots and pans and bags of flour, was Boris. He was enormous, with a massive tummy, big, bushy eyebrows and a huge, curly moustache. As they approached, he was reading Mr. Gribshaw's traditional pie recipe, scratching his head, and then pouring cupfuls of ingredients into a huge mixing bowl. "Boris," shouted Mr. Gribshaw, "there's 3 ladies and a gentleman here to see you." Boris immediately stopped what he was doing, looked up and smiled a huge smile. His eyebrows almost lifted from his face and he almost sang a greeting. "Hello, my ladies and gentlemen," he said in a thick Russian accent. "Please excuse my English is not very good, yes?" "His English isn't very good," explained Mr. Gribshaw. "I thought this might be the case," said Herman in an intriguing kind of way. But by now, everyone was very intrigued anyway. "Can I have a look at your recipe?" he said. "Yes, please, mine, yes, recipe, yes," said Boris, and he showed Herman the flour-covered work surface. A special book support had a crumpled piece of folded paper on which was written a recipe. "Gribshaw's traditional potato and vegetable pie. 1 pound of flour, 8 ounces of butter, 2 eggs, 2 pounds of potatoes, 2 pounds mixed vegetables, pinch of salt and vegetable stock." "Boris," said Herman. "Yes, me," said Boris. "Can you show me how much flour you put in the bowl to make 1 pie?" "Is no problem," smiled Boris proudly. They all watched as Boris measured flour into the bowl. First, he poured a 1 pound measure of flour in. They all watched. Then he poured in another pound measure of flour. Mr. Gribshaw rushed over to him. "Boris," he said, "you've put in twice the amount you're supposed to." "But, Mr. Gribshaw," protested Boris, "I follows the recipe." "I think I know what's happened," said Herman. "I do too," said Pearl. "And me," said Betty. "And me too," said Mavis. "What?" cried Mr. Gribshaw. "Boris comes from Russia," said Herman. "Yes, and so?" said Mr. Gribshaw in a confused sort of way. "In Russia, they measure everything in kilograms," said Herman. "And a kilogram is about twice as much as a pound," said Betty. "So Boris has been making your pies twice as big as they should be," concluded Pearl. "Oskakoski, Tromolinsky, Kavinsky, Kavinsky, Cossack," said Boris, but nobody quite knew what he meant. For the rest of the afternoon, Herman, Mavis, Betty and Pearl showed Boris how to measure out the correct quantity of ingredients and even gave him a hand making the first batch of pies, but normal-size ones again. And Mr. Gribshaw looked very relieved. "No more overfull customers on my account," he said, and he shook Herman warmly by the hand. "Thank you for all your help," said Mavis to Herman as they walked to the bus stop where Herman would catch the bus home. "My pleasure," said Herman. "I hope you don't mind," said Betty, "but we've made you a few sandwiches for your journey." "Thank you, that's very kind," said Herman. "And we've put in a pie too," said Pearl. "And some of your favourite cake," said Mavis. "If I eat all that," said Herman as the big red double-decker bus pulled into the bus stop, "I'll be fuller than the fullest person in Fullsville." and they all laughed.